thank you, Francis, to organize this event. So I'll be the chair of this session today. So we have 4 speakers, and I will first ask these speakers about how software development has shaped modern statistics and has shaped their careers. How did they get started? What kind of software they have created? So I will start first with Maëlle Salmon. She's a part-time research software engineer for R Open Science. She's also a consultant for several R packages, so she either develops those packages or she strengthens them. And she has a PhD in statistics from Ludwig Maximilian Universität from Munich. So Maëlle, can you tell us a little bit more about you and your experience in software development?
Okay, thank you. So one of the first tests I was given during my PhD was taking an algorithm from a statistical research paper and put it into an R function. And it was quite an interesting experience because then even the author of the paper was very happy to have the function available in a public R package. And that was, so it was quite cool. And I think that was my first experience developing R software. And these days, and as a research software engineer, I tend to view myself as a bridge between the most technical tools and people who have less time to explore them on their own. And I think the main tool to help them take advantage of the tools is documentation. So be it documentation of software or things such as log pods.
Thank you, Maëlle. I'll move on to Paula Martinez. So she's the software project coordinator for the ARDC and Research Software Alliance community manager. So she's leading projects of the software program to see, shape, and sustain research software. So Paula is deeply invested in leading changes in the recognition of research software as first-class output of research. And she has a PhD in bioinformatics. So Paula, do you want to tell us more about why it's that important for you to develop software?
Thanks, Kim. How I came about to research software engineer was I studied a Bachelor of Computer Science and major in software development. And then after working in the field, I realized I wanted to pursue my other dream that was study life sciences. So I did a master's in bioinformatics, and I ended in the computer and the mathematics and statistics department of Chalmers University of Technology. And that was the first time where I worked in a team that was multidisciplinary. I was the person with programming and development skills, and there was statisticians and domain experts, and we solve questions from science using programming, and they really appreciate my skills. So that's when I became more involved in the field. Then I did a PhD in bioinformatics. I developed tools for genomic analysis. I wanted to do diversity studies, and in all that trajectory, I realized that the skills that I was providing were seen as a supportive outcome. But there is a need to really put relevance on those skills, as this is as important as the research question, as the hypothesis, as the methodology. The algorithms are very important. And that's why I've been drawn to make the changes for all the people who are doing this career to have more relevance and recognition in their work.
Thanks, Paula. We also have Nick Golding, who develops methods and analysis to support control of COVID-19 and malaria. He's based at Curtin University, and he describes himself as a part-time epidemiologist, ecologist, and statistician. So Nick has developed over more than 20 R packages, including the Bayesian modeling R package, Greta. So Nick, do you want to comment a bit about how software development has shaped your career?
Yeah, thanks, Cameron. So the career has been a little bit scattershot. I'm interested in lots of different things. And so a lot of it's applied statistics, applied to ecology, applied to infectious diseases. And it was really during my PhD that I became really interested in open source software. And it may have been the experience of trying to interpret somebody else's Mathematica code in a script attached to a paper that then kind of prodded me in the direction of being really interested in making packages that make it really easy for other people to reuse that stuff. But that's definitely the direction my career went on very, very early on, is, you know, as you develop code to implement methods, it's just really nice added value to be able to turn them into a package so that other people can use them. And over the years, that's just proved to be, really, really useful in terms of leading to more collaborations and having more impact with research. And I definitely went through a phase, particularly developing the Greta software, which is much more general and widely usable. That there was a lot of focus there on real research software engineering. So primarily developing a piece of software that you think is going to be widely used by people for things you haven't even kind of imagined, as opposed to a really specific application of research. So it's been interesting, right?
Thanks, Nick. And our other speaker is Thomas Lumley, who's a professor of biostatistics at the University of Auckland. He's also a member of R-Core. And Thomas has been writing statistical and graphics software in different languages since high school. And he maintains the survey package in R, and he also has written software for genome-wide association analysis at the Cardiovascular Health Research Unit in Seattle. So Thomas, I'm really interested to know how you got started. Like, why were you so interested in developing software from an early age?
From an early age, I was writing software that my mother used for, the first one was something for sending summaries of data back to perinatal units at Victorian hospitals. We was a piece of graphic software written in BASIC. And then R, I worked in programming at the Clinical Trials Centre at Sydney Uni. And then I learned R while I was a PhD student, after seeing Ross Ihaka talk at the Australian Statistical Conference. And what I wanted was something like S+ that I could run on Linux. This was a motivation for quite a lot of people. But back then, R didn't work very well, so that you could actually improve it quite easily. And since then, I've been writing a lot of R packages. The survey package is perhaps the most widely used, but also quite a lot of others. And I've also been doing more sort of traditional research software engineering, occasionally in collaboration with epidemiologists, so that the cardiovascular researchers I worked with collected a whole lot of whole genome genotype data and needed to do things with it, and somebody needed to write the software. So that was my job. And so back when I started, people weren't at all interested. The statistics community wasn't really interested in software even as a second-class research output. It wasn't a research output at all, really. But now I think there's been a big change, and people think that even if it's not, a lot of people still don't think it's really first class, but they do think it's unavoidable that you take software seriously, even if it's unfortunate.
Okay, thanks, Thomas. So I will start with a few questions to the panel. If you have any questions related to the theme we're discussing now, feel free to either raise your hand or post your question on the chat, and we will try to have some time to ask those questions as well from you. So I guess the first question is going to be about how we define a research software engineer. Are there any difference with machine learning engineers, data science engineers, statisticians, engineers? Perhaps Paula, would you be able to comment a bit on the definition of what a research software engineer would be?
Okay. Research software engineer term was coined in 2012 by the Software Sustainability Institute in a collaborative workshop where people identify those that are programming and developing software in the research sector, rather to answer a question that it's from research, or they are developing a software during the research time. With the other concept of machine learning engineer, data science, and statisticians, I think there's a combination. All of these other roles also need to have some background in statistics. They need to understand how the functions work, how combinations of concepts work together. They also need to be able to program. Independent of the language, they need to put those algorithms into code, and they also need to verbalize and communicate the outcomes of those. So by producing visual outputs, by producing reports, by producing tables with statistics and summaries, and so on. I think machine learning is just a niche field. So a machine learning engineer will be those that are developing machine learning algorithms, testing or maintaining those. Data science, in my perspective, it's much bigger. You don't have to work in a research sector to be a data scientist, but you still answer questions and always try to find better solutions and implement improvements to those existing solutions. A little bit of that.
Thank you. Maëlle, I'd be a bit interested to know a bit more about your roles, because you have had part-time roles as research software engineer in Open Science, for example. And so I'd like to know a bit more about, how you use statistics in those roles. So, or what is your role about?
So I don't use much statistics in those roles, but I'm going to explain what UrbanSci does. So UrbanSci is a non-profit initiative that supports open and reproducible science through tooling and community building. And an important thing that we do is software peer review. So where packages are reviewed by 2 external reviewers, and this whole process is shepherded by volunteers. Reviewers are volunteers as well. And we've recently extended this software peer review system to statistical software. And yeah. And I don't know if it answered your question, sorry.
Yes, no, it's great. I think that leads to a very important issue that we're facing now is the quality of software. So there are more than 10,000 R packages in RCRAN and a bit more than 2,000 packages in Bioconductor. So that's an enormous amount of software. But I'm sure a lot of us have tried to use a specific package thinking, oh, this method is great, let's try it. And then you just can't run it. It seems that it is a bit of an incentive to submit an R package, for example, along with a method paper. But there's not enough importance made or enough incentive made to actually have those software workable for the practitioner. And so I guess my question is more, how do we make this available? How do we improve the quality of the software? Thomas, do you have any insights, given that you're working as a RCore member?
I mean, I do want to say that it's a lot better than it was 20 years ago. I mean, if you compare what's on CRAN to what was on StatLib, the software on CRAN will run its own examples on more than one computer, not just on the original author's computer. And that often wasn't true of pre-CRAN software. And I get the impression from things like XKCD cartoons that it's not entirely true in Python still. That, so that things are a lot better than they used to be. But I think part of it is that people don't, that there isn't funding, and there also, you don't get promotion and tenure coupons for your software being good. To get on CRAN is important, and that's a big step up from not being good enough to get on CRAN. But it's still not the quality, because software isn't regarded as a first-class research output by most people, the quality doesn't matter as much as it does for first-class research outputs. And I think that's the biggest barrier. Funding as well, but and that's sort of related in the sense that people don't have funding specifically to write papers, but they have funding and writing papers as an assumed part of it. But that's less true with software.
Yeah, so we will talk a bit more about the issue of funding, because that's a very obvious limitation. But I would like to ask Nick. Nick, you have experience in developing high quality software. So how do you enable this? Like, Maël talked about, reviewing software of others. What kind of other tools do you use?
I should also say I have a lot of experience in developing very low quality software too. Looking back at the first pieces of software that I've written during my PhD, a lot of things that you look back on and you see how much you've improved. And that's only possible because I've been able to do packages better than the last one. And it's as I think Thomas was pointing out quite nicely, it's sometimes CRAN is used as a bit of just as an archive, in the sense of this was a piece of research, this is up there now, this is just to score brownie points, as opposed to a piece of code that is really intended to be reused. And there are lots of things that you would do differently if you're essentially hoping for other people to reuse your code. And one of the main learnings for me, I think, is user interface. Just thinking really hard about how to design the interface to a package such that it's obvious how to use it, and so that it doesn't just suit your one application, but it's clear exactly how to go about it. So there's lots of different tools that you can use and different methods for doing that. But I think what Maël was saying about the peer review that rOpenSci does, and also I really like the general open source software's general approach to software peer review, which I think is quite similar to rOpenSci's. Is really nice for just having people able to give feedback in a really constructive way. And I actually think it's a really nice model for how peer review should happen for journals as well. So there's some really nice initiatives to help people to develop their own skills in developing software, because I think we need to help everyone in the kind of research community, particularly in the stats community, to understand that it is a skill set. It's not just a one-off quick thing just to turn something into an R package.
Yes, that's correct. It's not just about implementing a software using a specific language. It's also about thinking about the architecture of your software, and also thinking about the users and how they're going to be able to use your software. So Paula, you've
if we're, the other thing, we don't want to get too utopian about it. If you've got 14,000 packages, they're not all going to be above average. That's the other constraint.
Yes. So Paula, you've been advocating strongly to have research software as a first-class research output. What are your views on the incentive we could develop in the community, for example, at the university level?
That's a tricky question we've been discussing a lot in my work at ARDC, and many people that we ask, they say we want more recognition, and to be recognized you need to be seen. And so one of the incentives that we are creating together with different research domains are software awards. So as Amy mentioned at the beginning, now there's the Venables Award for creators of research software, and we have identified other communities that are willing to work on this, because it's the community who needs to recognize those authors and put their own processes and selection criteria, and they also are the ones that need to select those that are going to win the award. We also think that an incentive will be to have some specific interviews for people to be recognized as others. So if you see an example of someone similar who's been through your same career trajectory or has similar goals to you and they've achieved something, that's another incentive for you to continue your path or build into those goals similarly. For example, if you took specific courses, or if you develop specific software, or if you put your software in a very specific journal. Those are incentives for others to follow best practices. And the third incentive, I think, is especially for universities, is enable the visibility of the software, as they are all involved about metrics and they really care about getting first places. They not only should count how many publications researchers have, but all the research outcomes. And that's what we are trying to advocate for, that you can make visible your research software, you can be on search engines. So when people put your name or your ORCID ID, they will find what other things you are spending time, not only writing articles. And universities that enable this are going to be better seen. They're going to have the best counts of those authors, and they're going to be recognized. And certainly they're going to have also more and more grants, because there'll be more outcomes to contribute to.
And following on this, I wonder if it's also our responsibility as academics, as researchers, as professionals, to emphasize on the importance of software development when we present our biography, when we talk at job interviews, for example. And I'd like to ask that question to Nick. How have you used your software output to boost your career?
Yeah, so I've thought about this a lot, particularly over the last few years, how to kind of forge ahead a career with research software as a major part of it. And I kind of looked around me at various other researchers, particularly in the kind of statistical software area, who have had successful careers. And to be honest, so far, the people who've been successful have probably been able to get by in their careers without the software angle. And that's kind of piggybacked on the rest of statistical software development. And I just want to credit Miles McBain, who I think is on this call here, who introduced me to a quote and launched a minor existential crisis in me. So the William Stein, who is the author of the open source Sage maths software, and to paraphrase the quote, it's every great piece of scientific software is built on the ashes of somebody's academic career. Essentially, this idea that if you're spending all your time doing really good research software and really doing good software development, it doesn't leave a lot of time for everything else. I don't think that's entirely true. I think there are ways that you can really amplify grant applications, for example, by saying, look, we have this expertise and ensure we have a pathway to impact. But really the route that I've kind of decided to go down is to not make it my own main thing, but to be able to diversify across a bunch of fields. And then I can employ other people to do that sort of work on those grants. And if you can get enough grants with a little bit of research software in there, you can hopefully make up a whole post. I don't think that's the ideal situation. I think it would be much better going forward if we can have those outputs, the software themselves, really highly valued and not just papers. And as was said earlier, so Thomas was saying that the fact that the quality of things on CRAN and the reward structure for writing good software, it also comes down to the reward structure for maintaining software. You can get a paper out of the first version of the software, but it's very difficult to get future papers, even if you're putting a lot of time to maintaining a community resource. So the positive stuff, I think, is just being able to make the point that software is helping you to have impacts, and the way you grant applications and job applications and various things are structured now. A lot of people are focused on other things you can do for your community, and so it definitely checks those boxes. But I think until it's really valued alongside research research articles, it's never going to be quite so easy as to just be able to maintain a career just doing research software, which I think would be really, really beneficial, because research software can have really, really huge impact.
I think the software is becoming increasingly valued. From my experience, for example, it depends on the audience I'm talking to, but I know that people who do not work in my field are very keen to have software that is easy to use for them. And so this is how I sold my own software that way, saying, look, my methods may be a bit complicated for you, but in fact, you can use them easily. And I show you how. And I think it was quite successful on my end to sell it that way, but not to statisticians, actually, to people who other than statisticians.
I was just going to add as well, sorry, that I think that in statistics, people who are developing statistical software, I think are miles ahead of other areas of kind of research software development in being able to kind of make that case and make the point, because it is seen, especially now, as so widely useful to be able to do data science and fit these models. So events like this and statistics and computational statistics really has the opportunity to lead the way in making the point about how useful software is. And I think it could spill over into other fields as well.
I would like to ask Maël, because you are consulting to also strengthen or develop our packages, who are the people who consult you? What are their needs? Can you explain a little bit in your role what they're asking for?
So whereas the people who manage to get money in grants for software development or research software engineer, and as to what they're asking, well, they don't necessarily have the time or like their interest in writing the R code themselves. And so my role is to do that, to go out and research certain technical aspects and explain them to them, or write the code myself. So we're like a kind of a support role for their bigger research, but they're on the software engineering part. And it's quite lucky for me to come on board when they have both recognized the need to get someone else on board, and where we have gotten funding for that, obviously. So that's a lucky situation when that happens.
Yeah, and I think this is something we've been talking a little bit about now, is that it's actually very hard to do both, to do methods development as well as software development, because we only have one job. And I guess it leads to the question of, do we need to train the young statisticians to have additional skill sets in order to program better and develop high quality software, or should we kind of separate those disciplines a little bit and contract people such as software engineers, for example, or employ people such as software engineer to help us also to do that job? Thomas, do you have any views on that?
I don't know where you're going to get the software engineers need to know something about the content that they're engineering. And it's going to be difficult. So, you can take people who are studying statistics and also get them to study software engineering. But then the other problem is that there aren't currently jobs. Not in a sort of stable way. And so at least, one advantage of the current, a lot of the statistics research software that exists is paid for incidentally by the thing that supports most academics, which is teaching. But if you have people who are primarily research software engineers, that's not an option. And there needs to be a system for them to be paid stably over their careers for working in research. And they may not be, even if they're not necessarily the research leaders. And that's difficult in most funding structures, to have people like that. It's a problem not just to research software engineering, it's a problem for running clinical trial centers and things like that as well.
Yeah, and so that leads to also the question about, should we decide or should we unify the discipline a little bit using specific programming languages? Because at the moment, people can develop in Python, they can develop in R, and so is there a need also to have those, to agree on the type of language we should use? It seems like a lot of statisticians use R, but are there any other languages you think might be worthwhile looking at? Thomas, you have views on that?
I think there are too few programming languages being used for statistical software development. This was the theme of Ross Ihaka's, when we brought in the Ihaka lectures, he gave the first one. That was the theme of his lecture, is that there's basically not enough diversity in statistical programming systems. And that's different from the 1990s, where there were, you know, half a dozen. And I don't think there's any need to push people. I mean, people will tend to use what's popular. They used SAS, they're using R and Python now. I don't think there's any need to try and push towards uniformity. It happens too much on its own.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, programming is a skill in itself, and so if you have a good background in programming, then depending on what the needs are, you can focus on a specific language or not. Paula, is this something you have discussed within the ARDC on, you know, how can we include maybe more programming in the curriculum, especially in bachelor and major of statistics, for example, and what kind of programming languages we should teach in our universities?
That exact question we haven't discussed, but personally, I agree with Thomas that we don't need to have a uniform programming language. I think once you learn one language, it's easier to learn the next one, and you need to adapt to what is needed, and just reinforcing, yeah, people use what is most popular, what they need, what they find support for, and if they need something else, they will move on clearly. About our discussions in training, for example, we do have a discussion in research software engineer career advancement, for example, but we don't start with bachelor degrees. We start mostly with postgraduate studies, and then we see what are the gaps from one field to the other field that they will need to in advancing the RSE career. And those things are, if you come from a science background, for example, then you will need, of course, to learn programming, but then in advancing, you will need to learn how to optimize your code, how to work with more than one machine, how to do continuous improvements, and how to do testing, and then so on. If you come from the other side, if you are an expert in your domain expertise, you need also to give that into account. So there might be methods that only your domain is using, and those are the ones that you need to progress on coming from a different field. And then once you are a research software engineer, I think we've seen this gap that people don't know what else to do, and then they move on to industry, for example, because they have the programming skills, but then there's no more salary increment where they are working right now, so they need to look for something else. And to stop that bridge and letting people go and find other career outputs, what we discuss is what about having a research software engineer manager that is leading a team of people that are similar, those that can mentor others and further that career, or maybe a coordinator of different projects, a person who only does product development, for example. So getting more from the software development careers into the research area, and thus advance that software they are developing in the research sector.
Yes, thank you, Paula. We have one question from Vinicius, who's asking if organizations such as University Research Institute could provide more incentives for researchers who would like to become contributors or maintainers of large pre-existing research software packages. So it's more about, you know, how we can push our universities to recognize that role, and whether also, I guess, researchers who are interested in doing that can actually do this. Nick, do you have any views on that?
Yeah, thanks, Vinicius. And I think Xiqing was asking a similar question as well. It comes down to what the reward structure is for academia. At the moment, it is almost exclusively on research papers. to some degree quality, to a large degree quantity, and other things are important as well to make well-rounded people, but they're definitely not held on in the same regard. So there is one essential hack to doing that, which has been proposed, which is the Journal of Open Source Software that I mentioned earlier, which was explicitly designed as a hack that you could take your piece of software. First of all, there's peer review to make sure it's good software, and then you just write a really short paper and it gets essentially considered as a research article. And that's one way of doing that. And then you could essentially, so long as you kind of have a sufficient advance in your maintenance of the project, be able to package that up like it's a paper, and then put it on there, and then it goes on your CV. I don't think that's an ideal solution. I feel like there should be a better way rather than just piggybacking on the paper system, but something to that effect seems like it should be the right way of going about this. It's difficult otherwise to just, for example, just have a grant for maintaining a piece of software. Those do exist and they're really useful as well, but that's probably not going to be able to help across all of academia, and that'll be essentially focused on major infrastructure type projects. So I think really changing the academic reward system such that it can include those really important contributions it's really, really important.
Yeah, so actually at the University of Melbourne, we have a group called Melbourne Data Analytics Platform. And they're actually here to support researchers in developing software as a support group for academics. So it seems that it starts to appear now. Some universities start to realize that actually providing this support is important to researchers. I don't know if it's the case at the University of Auckland or in the other university you've worked in, Thomas, to see this kind of support being implemented.
No, not really. I mean, I liked we don't even have something like the Monash thing where we've sort of formally recognized software, and ongoing maintenance and development is a particularly difficult problem. I mean, so my survey package was published in 2004, but there's a lot more of it than there was then. But on the other hand, publishing it when it's already been published before becomes difficult. And I did have an agreement in principle from the Journal of Statistical Software that it would be eligible to be published again. I haven't actually submitted it, but I remember Tony Rossini talking about this problem in the early 2000s, that a lot of research software is incrementally developed over a long period of time, and it doesn't have a birthday the way a paper does, where it wasn't recognized before then and it is recognized afterwards. So it's hard to support ongoing development and maintenance, because everyone wants new things.
Yes, and I guess that comes down to the question of when do we decide to develop a software, and how do we then make it available to others? Maëlle, because you're working with people who are in need of developing software, do you see that they're all at the same stage? Like, I don't know, maybe the code is kind of there, but it needs to be packaged in something usable, or do you see different stages of development before you take on those projects?
I think pretty variable, but what I think is important is communicating the stage at which a software is. Like when you could write software as soon as you have a sort of piece of code you use in several places, but it's first experimental, then it becomes mature, then maybe it becomes deprecated, and just communicating that to potential users is quite key, because this software will change over time.
Yeah. I mean, my experience for my case is that I actually have some sort of a beta version first I try extensively on other data sets for my collaborators before I think, well, actually it is worth putting more effort in and making it available to the community. And I guess it all comes down to dissemination, and then how do you actually, communicate about your software? How do you track the uptake of your software? Because if you see that your software is not doing well, there's no downloads, is it worthwhile continuing, or do you want to make it often and then let it die or slowly? So Nick, do you track down the uptake of your packages and decide which one require more work, which one should just be let down?
Yeah, no, not so much. It's more focused on kind of my research interests and how many people are emailing me and asking me questions about a certain piece of research or a certain piece of software. I certainly have used things like download statistics for talking about the impact of my research. So for a promotion application, putting it in there and saying, not only did I write the software, but it's been downloaded this number of times. That's always a great number because the number of downloads always massively inflates who's using it. But that's another benefit to research software being misunderstood. But it is really difficult to actually get a handle on who's using it, how much impact it's having. And also depends on the type of package as to how you'd want to measure that. Because if it's an applied package, it just provides a model that people are using in applied work. You might see it cited perhaps in journal articles if people remember to cite their R packages. If it's something more fundamental that's used by a lot of different other R packages, but itself isn't used by an end user, then that's also very impactful, but it's very difficult to measure in the same way. So it's a difficult problem and an open problem, I know, that people are working on. So I don't track usage statistics in that way because I'm not sure that there is a particular good one. But yeah, it really comes back to who gets in touch because they want to use it, want an extra feature. And I have, I use GitHub for hosting the development version of all of my packages. So if people post an issue on there to indicate that they have a question or they want an extra feature, then that's a really good indication of what which packages would be most useful to be updated.
Yeah, and I think you raise an important issue here. It's really difficult to track the success of a package because we can look at the number of users we have. We can use the number of forks on GitHub. We can look at the number of views on the website if you have a website attached to your package. And so all these things are really difficult to actually show on a CV. You need to show almost everything in order to show the breadth of the use of your package. But I really think that that's something that's really important. If you want to make software development, a good portion of your activities, professional activities, is to actually report them in some meaningful way to your employer, for example, or your university. We're going to talk next about funding because one of the main issues in software development is to actually get money to develop and maintain software. So in Australia, we have the ARC and an HMRC funding system. In New Zealand, there's the Marsden Fund. I would like to ask, maybe I start with Thomas. What do you think? Do you think funding in New Zealand or in the US is recognizing the value of software development?
I think it's starting to in the US. So Bioconductor has had some very highly rated funded grant proposals for core bioconductor features. On the other hand, I've never had any funding specifically for software development. And it's always either been research funding where I may have said I will produce software as well, or other people's research funding where they haven't specified where the software is coming from, like the genome-wide association analyses we did. So there is in the US, Marsden, I don't think would fund it. That's supposed to be blue sky research. It might help your grant proposal if you said you would also provide software, to implement the things you discovered. I think it probably would help, but they're not going to fund software per se. The Health Research Council would also be relatively unlikely to, but they might. They funded some of the development of Beagle, which is a genomics phasing and imputation program that the Brownings were developing. So so occasionally you get funding, but I don't think it's a sort of, it's not really a thing in New Zealand, unless you were planning to sell the software. Then the Ministry of, then MBIE, the government might be interested in, you know, partnership type funding.
Yeah. Maëlle, do you have any insights on how are things are happening in Europe or in France? How do the people who contract you, how do they get the money for software development?
So as you say, like, it's a very biased sample, because the people I work with are the ones who succeeded in getting the money. Like, for instance, in one case recently, it was a very small grant that someone got from their local university for software development, and I'm not sure how often that happens. And in another case, a larger research project where part of the project was for contracting research software engineers. So I don't have any particular insight on names of institutions that would help.
Yeah, Paula, is the ARDC pushing also to have funding incentives only for software development?
That question is also tricky because ARDC doesn't want to be seen as a funder. We are co-investors. So in that way, we need partners that want to work together with ARDC in developing a program or a project, and in that way we can support them financially. As an example of that, we had a round of platform calls that lasted for 3 years, and they received some funding, but it was not only for software development. They had some part that included software development, but it's all the project management, the outcomes, and it's mostly for infrastructure that supports research. And that call is ending next year, and for after 2023, we are still looking at other pathways where we can contribute to the research infrastructure. So we don't have specific funds for maintaining or supporting new research software. But I wanted to also point to those who are interested. There is a blog post from the Research Software Alliance that came in February of this year, and they did an analysis of different funding agents, and they have categorized them on where they contribute. So either in the initial steps of the software landscape or in maintaining and supporting research software. And those are international organizations, so you can have a look and learn more from them. I put the link in the chat.
Yeah, thanks, Paula. Nick, how have you funded software development in your career?
Yeah, so I guess a few different ways. As Mel said, that sometimes universities or institutions provide small amounts of funding that can be applied for these things. So when I was at the University of Melbourne, there, for a short period of time at least, was a computational biology seed funding scheme, which provided small amounts of money for a variety of different things. But often with those, it's the sort of avenue where you can say, this is a thing that we're not likely to get funded on its own by a research body, but once it's up and running, it will be essentially an engine for a whole load of other research. So that's often a useful way to kind of kickstart a particular project. But then the longer term funding and anything bigger than that, really the only success I've had is by piggybacking on other research projects. So Greta, the kind of largest, certainly the biggest time suck piece of software that I've worked on, was funded because I got a research fellowship, which wasn't explicitly about the research software, but by having it, it was something that I used for all of the models that are in that fellowship. So I was able to dedicate a significant amount of time in that, but those are pretty hard to find. But for research grants, I think you can also simultaneously help the cause of making people aware how important research software is if you can argue that a certain amount of the time on this project is going to be spent taking the models we develop and putting them into actually disseminating that as code and research software, and saying that you can have a big impact that way. So you could normally shoehorn them into a larger research project to help tick that box of this is going to be a way that we're going to make sure the results are going to be used. So that's a way that can also be helpful for maintenance and adding on to other existing packages. But it's not the most straightforward way, and it, as a general strategy, only works if you're in a larger group, for example, that's getting in those kind of research groups quite regularly. Otherwise, it's just not possible to sustain a career that way.
I think my internet dropped.
Did we lose you, Karan? I can hear you, but I can't see you moving.
So I think Karan's internet dropped out.
Sad.
Okay, so maybe for the interest of just moving on to the next part. So there was a question in the chat, and it was a comment, but I also think that it can be posed as a question, which is about whether we are talking about open source software, but is there perhaps another pathway of funding it by actually putting software as a commercial product, put a license in it, and essentially have that as a way of funding it?
I think there is for some research software, but not others. So the survey package, people might buy it now, but they wouldn't have bought it 10 years ago when it would have been relevant. And R itself, I mean, the University of Auckland wanted to turn it into a commercial, or at least somewhat commercialized product in the 1990s, but I don't think it could have been successful in the 1990s in the sort of state it was in. So I think some software reaches usefulness too slowly for that model. You don't have the minimum viable product early enough, but other software I think it could be very useful for, potentially.
Sorry, you lost the chair for a bit, but I'm back. I think the problem about the fact that we want funding is to maintain the software, of course, but then it's to think about the legacy of the software. So people who have developed big packages like Thomas and Nick, what do you think is going to happen in a few years' time? Like, you know, are you anxious about the legacy of your package? Well, Nick, maybe.
Oh, I'm always anxious about the legacy of these things. I was actually, it was quite opening when I was speaking to a colleague who works in statistics, but not so much in software, when they asked me when Greta was going to be finished, which is not a question that makes sense if you work on software, because it's, you know, never ending. You're always adding little bits and tweaking things, but obviously at some point, a piece of software doesn't, you know, ceases to be useful enough to keep being maintained. Certainly with Greta, the list of things that we can add to it and that we think will be really useful is very long, and the only kind of issue with getting to them is just time and money and other distractions, like the pandemic that's kept most of us busy for quite a while. So yeah, I do think about those things. I have a bunch of pieces of software which were small and specific and needed at the time, and possibly not used so much anymore. For example, one package on joint species distribution modeling, which I think has been superseded by a bunch of other things, which I'm very happy to let go, because that was one of my earlier, much less good ones. And actually it comes back to what something that Maël said in the chat, which is that small pieces of software can be really useful too. And there's a time and a place for things. And often, you know, this is research. People have an infinite variety of incredibly specific research topics that they share with only a few other people in the world. And if one piece of software can help that really small community, then that's great. But often, you know, you move on and they get left behind. So I think that's a good thing. And it's the same as kind of statistical methods as well. It's the same sort of idea. You just got to work out what the natural evolution of that idea is, and whether it's time to move on to something else.
Okay, so I think we're going to take some questions from the audience now, but before I do that, I would like to ask to each of the the panel member, what would be their advice to early career statisticians who are interested in software development? I might start with Maëlle.
First of all, I would say with statisticians that what they're doing is a great idea to make methods available as software, which will make their work much more impactful. And I would recommend looking for the best community to surround oneself with, to learn with them, and to have people to ask questions to, like this events and other methods or such things.
Thank you. And Thomas, your advice?
I think the skills for being a research software engineer will have lots of other applications, so that while I'm dubious about, there's a definite risk that you won't get a career as a research software engineer, learning to be one, I think, learning the sort of statistics and data science and programming, software engineering ideas, I think those are very valuable skills. And so that you might end up as a research software engineer, which would be great, but there are also lots of other interesting things you can do with those skills.
Yeah, that's a great advice. Paula, do you have any advice?
I was thinking to mention dissemination from the very beginning, especially for the people who are just starting. Think about this from day one, so it's not a burden task that you have to do at the end of your project. And in dissemination, there's 4 points that I want you to think about. One is source code and the versions of your source code. So for you, for your future you, and for any other collaborator to see the source code, it's very important. Then documentation to understand that source code, metadata for people to find your software. So have as many keywords as possible, as many IDs, identifiers to your software, things that relate to your software, your publications, your dependencies, what other libraries are you calling. All of those things will get people to find your software and thus use it. And then when they find it, have a citation for them, because if they don't have something that it's useful for them to cite the software, they're simply not going to cite it, and thus you're not going to be recognized for your work. So those 4 things: source code, documentation, metadata, and citation.
Thanks, Paula. And Nick?
Yeah, I'd say if people are kind of working in statistics, interested in research software, then get into it. Have a play with software, writing software, doing it, because it's fun. It's really, really rewarding to learn those new skills and to be able to take part in the communities that people have already mentioned. Because particularly the R package community, and particularly that around R OpenSci and a bunch of other kind of forums, are really supportive. And there's lots of materials out there to do some really, really nice stuff. Academia can be perilous anyway. So I certainly would recommend sticking with what you think is really interesting. And exactly as Thomas says, there'll be loads of people in industry who'd be really happy to employ somebody with these skill sets. And in a lot of areas of research science as well, people are really in really high demand. So during the pandemic, see lots of people have infectious disease modelers in Australia, in particular, I've been working with, have had a lot of work to do and been looking to recruit people. And people with that research software engineering skill set are the ideal people, but people with kind of that and the domain knowledge are pretty hard to find. So there's always going to be places that will be really, really value those types of skills. So absolutely go for it.
Yes, I definitely agree with you that, learning how to program and to program well is key now in statistics. And so we shouldn't dismiss those skill sets. And also disseminating, being visible to the community is really important in software development. That's really going to help you shine. And as Nick said, it's really rewarding to exchange with other people who use your tool. It leads to a lot of collaborations as well from different disciplines, and that's also very exciting. Now, does the audience have any question to our panel members? So Thomas Fang asked on the chat, do you think university should accept maintaining an existing piece of software as an acceptable contribution for a PhD? Recognition software maintenance is a tricky but a really important issue. Thomas, you would like to answer that question?
Well, I mean, so PhDs are supposed, PhDs are supposed to be about an original contribution to human knowledge. And that's about, that's sort of the only thing that everyone agrees on that's a component of a PhD. So I think that it's an important thing to do, but it's not necessarily the sort of thing that you should get a PhD from, unless it is in some way a research activity that you should be able to get, that you should possibly, that it should have recognition, but I don't think the recognition comes from pretending it's research if it isn't research. I mean, if it is research, then obviously you should be able to. But if it isn't, then I think it should be recognized for its own sake as software maintenance and development.
Yeah. Amy, you have a question?
Yeah, so my question is about the teaching of the software that you develop. Like, what do you think the balance is? So writing things, investing your time writing tutorials, giving workshops, because these don't often really count per se. What do you see that for balance?
Nick, do you have any experience? I'm sure you have a lot of experience in running workshops and teaching people on how to use software.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, particularly in its own right, just teaching courses is really helpful for people who develop software because it's really good to get feedback. And it's one of the best ways to get feedback on what people understand, what people don't understand. In terms of the balance, getting it right for your academic career, again, it comes back to the same things about what the current reward structure is, and if there's more reward for doing those sorts of things, then you should do more of that. There certainly is when you apply for things like promotion. If you're like I am, kind of when I was applying for promotion from a research only position without experience of teaching, there was kind of an expectation for teaching in the promotion work there, but in that role where I wasn't kind of a lecturer, all of the external teaching that I'd done and materials that I'd made available around my software kind of check that box in terms of helping people who already have this kind of set things they're looking for to understand that that is a valuable contribution, and it is an important part of academia is disseminating that knowledge. So I would say if you can, if you have the time to do it, then making sure you do it and also record what you've done and make it clear to people in applications, grant applications, promotion applications, that sort of thing, exactly what your impact has been around those tutorials and training courses, then that should be understood and acknowledged every bit as much as kind of teaching an undergraduate course.
Yeah, and also remember that by teaching about your software, you're also increasing your user base. So there are also some good advantages in doing that. I think the time is up now. So thank you to our panelists for all this insightful discussion. And I think I head over to Amy to close out this interesting meeting.
Well, thank you very much for all the panelists, as well as Associate Professor Kim-Hwan Lukao for chairing the session. So we will be disseminating the recording afterwards, and we'll close up the session now.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
You might keep it open for a little bit because there's a chat going on as well. Yeah. Yeah. I think that's a pretty fair quote from Nick, because I think Nick Turney, by the way, because I think one of the issues is, in some sense, like, are we just preaching to the converted with this discussion? Like, in the sense that do we know all this, but we're just not doing anything about it? Or is it just one of those things whereby do we just, you know, let the ball slowly roll down the hill? I'm not advocating that. I'm just saying that I think there is an element of that people feel an aspect of that.
Yeah. I mean, I think things are improving. I mean, writing statistical software isn't, you know, if you're a junior academic, writing statistical software is not a liability to your career at the moment. I mean, it competes with other things you could do that would promote your career, but it's not intrinsically a liability. And that really wasn't true when I was young. So I think but yes, and there are improvements. I mean, you know, there's the recognition, the sort of formal recognition of software that Monash did. I mean, I think there are things that the professional organizations could do. One that we talked about again 20 years ago was that professional organizations could make available referees for departments doing promotions, you know, because your department might not have anybody who's competent to evaluate a software portfolio, and groups like the ASA sections on computing graphics or the SSAI sections could, you know, provide lists of people who would be willing to do. I mean, so I think that's something that could be done. But on the other hand, we were saying it could be done 20 years ago, so there may be some barrier.
I think it's improving. It's definitely improving. So just give it another few years.
Well, also, I mean, try and make it improve faster. But the other thing is that there's a bottleneck. I mean, the Journal of Statistical Software and the Journal of Open Source Software are wonderful, but they're a bottleneck. I mean, they're getting rushed by all the, there's more demand than supply for journals of software at the moment. So JSS, notoriously, about like 10 years ago, its review times shot up because there was a huge increase in demand and not a huge increase in supply of reviewers. And I think, and the same sort of thing, I mean, JOSS, there was some posts a few years ago about how they were getting a backlog of, and, you know, needed more reviewers and that sort of thing. So that's encouraging in the sense that there's demand, but it also means that there's even more reviewing needed by the same small number of enlightened people.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think, yeah, it's a really good point that everything is improving. So somebody pointed out to me a while ago, and things only improve because there are a core of people who are pushing really hard to make it go in that direction. So yeah, I think, Nick, you're absolutely right. There's more that can be done than just talking about. This is an important kind of step. And I think there have been, in discussions about research software engineering, essentially two different models of what research software engineers might look like. One of them is very similar to the statistical consulting perspective, which is that you can have a core group of people with software expertise who can be hired out to specific projects. And I think that's really valuable for certain types of projects. And then the other model is essentially researchers who are also specialists in research software engineering. And those have driven a completely different set of improvements. And I think that's particularly relevant to statistics here. And for the first group there, that, you know, you can push that forward by having institutional funding. You can have in universities like University of Melbourne's MBAP, which funds people who can do this role and support other researchers. But the other group of people who are researchers really embedded in a discipline and also do research software, you can only change that by having the reward system include those outputs, not just at an institution, but at the institution that may be applying for a job at all the different granting bodies, so everywhere. And that's an incredibly difficult kind of systemic cultural change that's required. And I think the only way to do that is for the people who are on those panels, promotion panels, grant review panels, all those sorts of things to for themselves just recognize and reward those things. And we can probably only get that out there as, and you know, another generation moves up into those kind of senior positions. So as much as we can clamour now and get people to be aware of that, and all these incremental things like just getting people to cite the software that they use, hopefully all of those things will just lead to more awareness and ultimately lead to that kind of bigger change further down the line.
Okay, I think we could wrap up now. Amy?
I think so. Well, thank you very much. I thought all the discussion was really interesting. And certainly for myself, I have a lot of interest in the topic. Well, thank you, everybody. And I hope you all have a good night.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for all